Welcome to Ortho Insider, the podcast brought to you by the Canadian Orthopedic Association that goes behind the scenes and shows the human side of orthopedics. My name is Dr. Adrian Huang, and I'll be your host for this inaugural series. On this episode, we have Dr. Laurie Hiemstra, and she's an orthopedic surgeon specializing in sports medicine and specifically patellofemoral instability, and you practice in Banff, Alberta. She's a founding member of IOTA, which is the International Orthopedic Diversity Alliance, and she just finished her term as the president of the Canadian Orthopedic Association. Welcome, Laurie. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Adrian.
So you just finished your term, and your focus was on diversity. Tell us how your upbringing with respect to your family and your mentors helped guide you towards orthopedics and towards the idea of diversity.
That's a great question. I'm the first doctor in my family. I come from immigrant families, so both my parents were not born in Canada. They were born in Europe, in Holland. I grew up in a family with 4 kids. I had two older brothers and a younger sister. And honestly, I have an awesome mother. And she brought me up to think that I could be anything I wanted to be. So I really didn't have a lot of limits placed on me, like as far as my occupation went. And I actually decided I wanted to be a doctor when I was in grade 1, which sounds really crazy, and I don't actually recommend people to decide that early. But in grade 1, we did this project where we lay on the mural paper, because I was actually short back then, and we outlined our bodies, and we took the red and blue yarn, and we pasted or glued on the arteries and veins. We were learning about arteries and veins, and I was so enthralled. I thought this was the best thing ever. And I still remember to that day is when I decided I was going to be a doctor. And so I don't know, that stuck with me for whatever reason. But probably getting into orthopedics was more part of my athletic career. So I was a pretty high-level fastball player. I played club within Canada. I played on the Canadian national team, and then I played in college. And I think it was really my exposure to sports and sporting, which is not an uncommon story in orthopedics, but that was really solidified my desire to go into sport medicine orthopedics.
Early on, you've identified your softball coach as one of your mentors, Mr. Smith. Can you tell us about Mr. Smith and how he guided you early on?
Mr. Smith was our softball coach in Toronto, in my team in Toronto. And the man coached a bunch of 16-year-old girls. I was probably 14 to 17 when I was with him. And I grew up with a single mother family. My dad was around, but not too much. But Mr. Smith really stepped into that male role model for me, and his daughter was one of my best friends. And they just took me into their family, and he is the most amazing man. He was a coach, but he was a father to every girl on that team. And in fact, I think my team is actually out at the Blue Jay game today, and he's with them, and I'm missing it. They are all out together. Like, we still get together to this day every time I get a chance to get to Toronto. But he was really instrumental. I think he really believed in the girls, and he believed everyone could be the best person they could be. And he really equipped us to believe in ourselves. I think that was really important for me in my formative years. And I don't know if him being of Caribbean descent made any difference in that, but to me, diversity was just part of my world.
It's very interesting that you have these amazing role models early on that enabled you and allowed you to have that belief that you could do anything. And even nowadays, we have so many medical students who come up and say that female medical students that come up and say they cannot be an orthopedic surgeon because they're physically too small and not strong enough. How does someone like you, who's in such an incredible leadership position, what would you tell upcoming medical students and residents and next generations on how to overcome those barriers and those biases?
When people say things like that, it really upsets me, because that's not, we weren't born. You're not 4 years old going, oh, I can't do that because I'm a girl. Those are social things that are told to us. We're told we can't do these things because we're not strong enough. There's plenty of boys that aren't strong enough, and there's plenty of girls that are plenty strong enough. It's not about being strong. It's about those gender stereotypes and what people are told. And that really upsets me, because that pushes down on their ego and how they feel about themselves and what others are telling them they can accomplish in the world. I heard one person say, you shouldn't tell people they can be anything they want to be. Well, actually, you know what? You actually can't be anything. I will never be an Olympic gymnast, right? I'm 5'11", like that is not happening. But within what, the skill set you've been given, you can be anything that you have the skill to be. So to me, you should never be told you can't be something because you're a girl. I might not ever be a mathematician because I not have a head for numbers or something like that, but not because of your gender or your sexual orientation or your color. Like those are not things that define who we are from a skill and thinking perspective. And so to me, when I hear that, it's because other people have told them that.
You speak so passionately about equality and diversity and gender biases. Tell us more about that. How are these implicit biases pervasive within not just our culture, but within orthopedics? And what are we doing to change that?
It's a great question, because honestly, if you had asked me that question about 7 years ago, I would have said, no, there's not too many biases. I didn't even notice there weren't that many women in orthopedics in Canada. I kind of did my thing, and I was lucky I wasn't told I couldn't do anything because I was a girl. It was the COA that got me started on this, and I was starting to get past my first 5 years of my career, and I really wanted to take a more leadership role. So I had called one of my mentors, Peter McDonald, who in Winnipeg was my program director and has a past president of the COA. And I said, you know what, Pete, I want to get a little more involved. Like, what should I do? He said, well, get on some committees, and I did that. And I was really wanting to get more involved. And an advertisement came out that they were adding a position to the executive. So they added the executive member at large, which really is supposed to represent the general membership. And I work in a distributed site, so I was in Banff. I wasn't at a university center, so I applied for it. And I got it. Honestly, the first day I walked into my first executive in the middle of a snowstorm in Toronto at the midwinter meeting, I was the first woman who'd ever been on the executive of the COA. At the end of that meeting, Cynthia, who's now our CEO, came up to me along with Trinity, who used to work with us, and they're like, we really want you to work on gender diversity. I was like, really? Really? Because, part of you sits there and says, you're the only girl here, so now all of a sudden you have to represent all girls. But the more I looked at it, the more you can see that our society is really built on a patriarchy. And so many of these patriarchal ideals are just built into our society that they're so normalized that even women like me, who's now an orthopedic surgeon, actually don't even see them. And it wasn't until I started doing a lot more reading and research and really educating myself that I realized that I suffered from all these biases also, and suffered because of them. And way less than many people. Like, I really have been treated exceedingly well, but you can still see them. And then you wonder about people that haven't been treated as well as me, maybe in different environments. I've had a pretty reasonable run at things, but our whole society is like this. It's not just orthopedics, it's medicine, it's business. It's a lot of talk about lawyers now and in the law profession. And our society is just very patriarchal, and there's so many of these biases built in. And it wasn't really until I educated myself that I saw that clearly.
Can you give us a couple of examples of these?
Just things like, I have a very hard time getting research dollars. You finish your fellowship, all of a sudden, there's lots of male surgeons, and they deserve it, don't get me wrong, it's not that they don't, but right away they're on the speaking tour, right away they're giving talks for industry, right away, boom, they get a big grant, and all of a sudden they have all these research money. I've been self-funding my research. I get very few grants, and I don't know why. Like, we do great research, I'm well published. If you take my CV and make it equal, I seem to not get a lot of money. Maybe it'll all come pouring in after this podcast.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Maybe I don't deserve the grants, but it just seems like the men are getting a lot of grants. And if you actually look at the literature that's done on research funding, it is true across the board and across countries and continents that women get less research funding. And I'm like, well, maybe that's why I haven't gotten as much. There's just the little things like that. And I'm just as guilty of this. We always say, hey guys, what are we doing, guys? I'm looking at the room, and half the room is girls. And I know guys has come pretty commonplace language for, you people, but it still is guys. And so that gets reinforced over and over, generation after generation, that, the guys belong in the room and maybe the girls don't belong. And it's just built into our language. And language does matter when that's reinforced over and over again.
And so now that you've done this deeper dive into EDI, what does that mean for you personally? What does it look like in the next steps in terms of solving some of these barriers?
So I think that's been our journey for the last 5 years that I've been on or however many years been on the exec and board, is really trying to change culture. And that was my inauguration speech last year, is really looking at what are we doing? How is our culture? What's the history of our culture? And why is it that way? And then really trying to change culture so it's inclusive. And it's not just for women. I mean, I think it's for all underrepresented groups. You know, there's many underrepresented groups. And I think a lot of it has been the efforts I've had done in the last 5 years is about education. So just like I went through, and I'll be the first one to admit that I didn't think there was that much problem until I started looking at it. I think many people, they're ignorant, not in the bad word ignorant, but ignorant in that they don't realize it's going on. And once you point it out, people actually start coming up to you and saying, oh, I couldn't believe it. I just went in that talk, and yeah, they called the group a guy, 42 times. And you just start seeing these little bits of bias that are in our world that we don't even notice them, but it doesn't mean they don't have an effect on people.
You've been this incredible leader, and you've been able to overcome these, and you were a founding member of IOTA, which is the International Orthopedic Diversity Alliance, and you were the first female president of the Canadian Orthopedic Association. What does that mean to you?
I'm super proud. Probably my proudest moment is this meeting that we're just at now has been, I think, a huge success. I've had several people come up to me in the hallway and just say, Laurie, I can see a difference in the COA in the last 5 years. And I know COVID was in there and we didn't meet for a while, but I looked around the lobby and it was so diverse on so many levels. And we've introduced programming over the last few years to help educate people. And I think people are really listening and they're being very appreciative. And I'm sure there's some people that don't like it, but for the most part, I think we've really started to change culture. And I think the COA is a different place than it was 10 years ago. And that makes me really, really proud that I could have been a part of that.
Yeah, you've done an amazing job. I mean, you've led us through this rebranding. Walking around the halls here, it is palpable, the excitement and the engagement of all the members. It's really almost like you took this blank slate and kind of painted it with these new colors and this new brush. And it's actually very, very wonderful. So as part of the membership and part of the communications committee, I just want to thank you for your work. You really, really have done a wonderful job in terms of leadership. You also speak very passionately about, as part of the EDI, the difference between equality and equity. Can you touch on that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. These are part of the education. These are words that have definitions, and it really is part of the whole EDI thinking. So, again, you're a guy and I'm a girl. We're not equal. Equal means you're exactly the same. And we're not exactly the same. I'm taller than you, right? And you're smarter than me. And, we're not equal. And no one would ever say that men and women are the same. We have different qualities. We have different strengths. We have different weaknesses. You don't want everybody to be exactly the same, or we'd all have the same job and there'd be no diversity. So when we talk about equity, we talk about equality of opportunity. If, for example, women have had barriers placed in front of them since we were little girls, and we talked about people telling young girls that they can't be surgeons and they can't be doctors, those are barriers, and those are barriers that exist. So if people are disadvantaged at every step, they actually don't have the same opportunity for leadership positions. And so if you're going to have equity, you have to lift up the people who have had barriers to get rid of the barriers so that you have equal opportunity. So someone who has had many barriers placed in front of them should have just as much opportunity to become COA president as someone who's been privileged their whole life.
How do we go about creating more equality of opportunity, especially in our own society where there is a lot placed on wealth and privilege?
Yeah, it's the $1 million question for sure. But I think, to me, education is really important. So, we talk a lot about privilege, and we all have privilege. And we don't earn our privilege. It's what we have. I have privilege walking into a room because I'm tall and white. But I need to understand that when, the privilege you have when you walk in a room. And so people understanding their privilege makes them see what other people are experiencing. And so when you really put yourself in someone else's shoes, I think it brings a lot more understanding to what people are facing and the barriers. And so I think the ultimate answer to your question is we have to get rid of the barriers. And we can't get rid of barriers unless we understand what those barriers are, and we can't understand them unless we can understand what other people experience in the same situation.
You're so good at that, putting yourself in somebody else's shoes and being a great communicator. There is a stereotype that surgeons just like to hear themselves talk. So was this a learned skill, or is it something that you've always kind of had? And if it was a learned skill, how do you teach the next generation of people to have that and almost have that empathy for somebody else?
I don't know. You have to ask someone who knew me when I was younger, maybe. I just find you're good at what you're passionate about. And I would never have guessed that the whole diversity space would have been something I was passionate about. And in fact, if you asked me 20 years ago, I would have said it absolutely is not what I would be into. So I think there's so many people out in the world that have so much to offer. And we're not taking advantage of the full potential of our human race if we don't allow people to use their potential for the good of others.
I'm not exactly sure how to put this necessarily, but everybody has their own lived experience. Yet, as an organization, for example, the Canadian Orthopedic Association, we need to put together guidelines. They're quite generic. So how do you take everyone's lived experiences and making sure these guidelines will represent most people?
I think if guidelines are based on the right thing, if you do the right thing for the right reasons, you're going to do good. I think honestly for the COA, I thought this was going to be a much harder struggle, but I think the membership was so ripe for this change. I think so many people were ready for this, that it was a much easier job than I thought it was going to be, which is great.
That is great. Yeah, it definitely came at the right time. And I agree with you. And you've done a wonderful job. And I think you're going to leave an incredible legacy of diversity and change and, ushering in a new era, if you will. So congratulations. It's been wonderful. So changing gears a little bit, we talk a lot about your advocacy work in diversity and your leadership. But you also have a very, very bustling clinical practice. You have fellows every year. I just met a couple of your fellows outside. And how do you balance all of that?
They just asked me this downstairs. I don't believe in balance. So I hate that question. Not the question. The question's excellent, but how it's always phrased, right? They always talk about work-life balance. And quite honestly, we're never in balance, right? And balance means like I'm half working and half, having fun. And like, I don't think that's anybody. So I think it's managing. And so we'd like to talk about work-life integration and how do you manage, your time between the two so that you don't burn out. And as you know, we've done some research on burnout also. So I think a lot of it is knowing yourself, and some of this is taking courses. Like I wasn't born knowing this, but I've taken courses, I listen to podcasts, I educate myself, and use other people. So, I have an executive coach that helps me when I need to. I think that coaching is super important. All athletes have coaches. Why wouldn't a professional or an executive or, a leader have a coach? The balance, the unbalanced balance is very important. But I think you also have to understand you go through seasons. So this last 4 weeks, I can tell you I cannot function at this level. It's 12 months a year. I had traveling fellows. I had a meeting in Boston. I came straight to this meeting. It's been very busy. I can do that because I knew it was for 3.5 weeks. And I know that, a couple hours from now, I can go sit on my deck and pet my dog and relax with a glass of wine and not think about anything. Just like you can get ready for the playoffs if you're an NHL hockey player. You don't have to shave ever, but you can make that effort for short periods of time, but you cannot do that forever. You'll burn out. So really understanding that life has seasons and you can do things and making sure you make time for yourself and your friends and your family is so important.
Yeah, that's wonderful advice, especially for all the aspiring surgeons and the young surgeons, that the idea of balance is not a 50-50 pure balance. It's something, as you mentioned, you go hard when you need to, and you can take breaks when It sounds like for you, it's all about planning. It's going to be for 3 weeks, and then I can take a break with a glass of wine on my deck, which is coming up soon, so we won't keep it for too much longer. Maybe hidden among all of your accolades in your CV is that you have a PhD, and you do a lot of research in patellofemoral instability. So tell me a little about your research and why you're so passionate about patellofemoral instability.
Yeah, so I got my PhD I started it during my residency, and I might blame Pete McDonald for this one too. So, no, I was just doing my resident research project like we all have to do. I didn't think I was going to be interested in research, but you have to do your project when you're a resident. And I got hooked into a sport medicine-y type project looking at neuromuscular changes after ACL injury and surgery. And it turned really good. And I won the Cora Award. So I'm going to blame COA for everything. So anyway, and then they just said, do you want to change this? If you just do a little more work, this was almost a master's thesis project. If you do, a little bit more, you could have a PhD. And I'm like, well, all right. But, I worked at it. And when I started practicing Calgary, my partners were very supportive. And they even made me take a few months off work just to finish the thesis. Because, of course, you're starting practice. You know how busy that is. And actually, Nick Motati sat me down. He's like, you're taking some time off to finish your thesis or you're never going to finish it. So very supportive partners. And I finished my thesis. So I really thought I was going to be a researcher, which I am a researcher. But so this whole diversity thing has been a little offshoot that I didn't intend, but I'm really enjoying. So we continue to do our research in Banff.
Yeah, quite prolifically or very well. You have just spoken about some of the mentors, and you also talk about you have an executive business coach. How important is that in terms of just your career and advancement and growth? And how do aspiring surgeons find those types of people?
Yeah, so I think my leadership education really began, I took a course in women in healthcare leadership out of Harvard. And I know several other people have taken it through our leadership scholarship lately. And I went to that just before COVID, so it was in person. And that actually really changed my thinking. It was my first exposure to really like a conference where you talked about all these different aspects of leadership. So, mentorship and difficult conversations and, all those things that are skills. Because you're not just born a leader. I think that's absolutely not true. You might have some leadership qualities, but leadership skills really are learned. So my first thing is to tell people, and we just talked about this in our session, is go to some courses, like learn what your strengths are and learn about mentorship, about these things, because we're really not taught them in medical school. We're not taught them in residency. It's almost expected that if you got into medical school, you must be a leader, right?
A leader, an educator, a mentor, everything.
Everything.
Yeah.
And we're not. And so those really are skills. And I think that's when my career really changed, is when I actually started taking those courses and learning more about myself. As far as the coach goes, she's wonderful, but she really, I think, helped me more see what my personality was. I come to conclusions very quickly. And she's like, you expect everyone around you to be the same. Some people need, some time to digest that and think about it. I'm like, really? So I think where the coach really helped me was in understanding myself. And, it's not like it's so rocket science. Like these are things you can probably read about on the internet and in some books. But for where a coach really helps, I think, is they get to know you. And then she can put that into perspective where I understand myself, which helps me understand the people that I'm talking to, which just makes you a better leader. It was so helpful. Everyone should be able to benefit from that.
And we do have that program at the COA now. And this year I also noticed that we have matched mentors at the COA for the residents and the trainees, which I think is just wonderful. It all goes back to what you're saying, how if you understand your own personality as well as the personalities that other people may have, it helps you understand their perspectives, their point of view so much more. And what you said about the personality really strikes a chord with myself as well, because I recently went on the North American Traveling Fellowship with the AOA. It's all about leadership. And one of my co-fellows also was talking about diversity and EDI, and she actually did the personality test on all of us. And almost it saved the fellowship a little bit, because we're almost at a fracture point, because we had 2 extroverts, 2 introverts, and 1 person right in the middle, but we didn't understand that. And so now understanding that, we were finally able to understand where each person was coming from. So I thought that was so important. And it is shocking, knowing what I know now, that is not taught in residency.
No kidding. It's crazy. Even just the introvert extrovert part. like clearly extrovert, right? Like
Yes.
I almost died during COVID. But like, you know, to understand that when we go into a room and it's, I don't know, cocktails or whatever, like I walk in, I'm like, hi, who are you? Like, tell me about yourself. And other people, that's a really stressful situation, right? It just goes back to the whole thing, putting yourself in someone else's shoes for just a second, like taking a pause and just thinking what that other person is experiencing, and that they don't experience things the exact same way you do. And I think that's almost the key, right? It's that little bit of empathy.
So you have the opportunity now as a past president, sorry to say, Madam Past President, to do what's called the Carousel, where you travel to the other orthopedic associations around the world and share ideas and cross-pollinate. Tell us a little bit about that. Are you excited for this? What are your goals for it, and what do you hope to get out of it?
So I'm very excited, being the extrovert that I am, and my other passion is travel. So I love travel, and I love other cultures and learning about other cultures. So the Carousel is perfect for me. But what it is, it's a little bit of a hangover from the Commonwealth. So it's the Commonwealth type countries. So South Africa, England, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, US. I'm sure the US doesn't want to be thought of as Commonwealth, but they're in there. So or I guess maybe it's the English speaking countries also. So all the presidents or past president, depending on the association, will travel that year to each other country's national meeting. So we hosted the Carousel here in Calgary just this week. But I love it. I think it's a really great program because, again, you learn from other people. So if we sit here in Canada and all we do is talk about what happens in Canada, we have some diversity in Canada because we have East and West and we have mountain, and we have distributed sites and academic sites. But, to know what's going on in other parts of the world, what challenges they face, what are their trigger points, what are their barriers, what successes have they had, So again, all our medical systems are a little bit different, but there's common points in there. So how can we use what other countries have done and learned or screwed up or whatever, and how can we take that back to Canada and make our country better? So I think the Carousel is a great opportunity. It also showcases to the world that Canada is awesome. Like, we are awesome. We have such amazing academic, teaching, researching orthopedic surgeons. We should be so proud of ourselves. And it does give us that opportunity to showcase ourselves to the rest of the world and let them learn from our successes and failures. I'm really looking forward to what we can learn from that.
Laurie, if somebody wants to get a hold of you, what's the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, so probably by email is the best way to get a hold of me. My email's easy, Hiemstra, my last name, at banffsportmed.ca. I'm talking to people all the time about all those things. You can also find me through our website, which is www.banffsportmed.ca. And we have lots about our fellowship program in there. We have lots about our research on there, lots about our clinic. And we have lots of really good surgeons in Banff, not just me. We have a really great team. And so people can find out about us through that.
Amazing. Dr. Laurie Hiemstra, thank you again, and thank you for an incredibly successful term as COA president. We really appreciate your time and very much looking forward to the update from the Carousel.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Adrian.
Thanks.